Hello, my name's Richard Walker, and I write about happiness. I studied happiness actually, and it came as a result of working for people for maybe some 15, 16 years now, carrying out therapy. So here's the first question. People often ask me, well, okay, what's your take on happiness? What is it? Well, it's a very good question. People have struggled for some 2,000 years at least to try and understand happiness, and yet we're trying to explain it in a quick, flippant reply. And it takes a bit more to really understand what exactly is happiness. Having a laugh, feeling good. Well, if it's that, where do bad feelings fit in? Negative emotions fit in? Are they just the flip side of the coin? Some say you need sadness to feel happiness, bad times to know good times. Is it true? Well, what makes you feel good? If that's different for different people, does it matter? So, what about consequences? Do they matter? Should we take them into account? Well, Hitler was pretty happy strolling into Paris, from what I understand, and there have been many famous cases of people doing things that made them happy, which made others very unhappy. So, what about consequences? And for who? How should you weigh them up? And what if they differ from person to person, which they do, from culture to culture, which you know they do, and in the past compared to now, which you know it does, and the future, what's in the post. And so if there are consequences as a result of each pursuing what makes us happy, each of us happy, then maybe there's more to happiness than just our good feelings. And what about what religion and ancient spiritual ideas have to say around happiness, Buddhism and so on, and other ancient ideas? Do they have anything to teach us? See, here's the thing. Whilst we now almost universally accept, in the Western world at least, that the pursuit of happiness is a good thing, and not all parts of the Western world believe that, by the way, it's not always been the case. And neither has our understanding of the nature of happiness always been constant. It's changed. In fact, the very belief that we have the right to achieve happiness is a relatively modern idea within the last 2,000 years, at least, and maybe in the last few hundred. Let alone the capacity to achieve it. These things have been debated passionately and at great depth over many hundreds of years, actually. And this debate is not just academic, it's far from academic, since the evidence is that ever since we actively began pursuing happiness, happiness has remained stubbornly elusive to define and to achieve. And that's worth just bearing in mind. Over 50,000 years of human history, happiness scarcely existed. Happiness is a relatively recent phenomenon, as I said, having taken its first baby steps perhaps with Socrates some 2,400 years ago. In the West, very little changed until the dawn of the Enlightenment, about 400 years ago. Psychology, which kicked off only about 100 years ago, just over, talks about happiness as a feeling. They talk of positive effect, and they talk of life satisfaction these days, all of which falls under what's often now called subjective well-being. Subjective well-being. It's all about the person. And happiness is considered the same for each of us. It makes no difference. As if it makes no difference what makes you happy or me happy. Well, I don't buy that. I'd ask you to consider consequences. I think, for example, Nelson Mandela's happiness is different from what you get when you kick a goal at football. I think that Martin Luther King's happiness, that Martin Luther King's dream mattered more than the athlete's dream to win a gold medal. In other words, I think consequences are a feature of happiness. Whether we like it or not, they're sewn within the fabric of it. And I call this depth, the vertical dimension to happiness. And I believe that happiness points us in a direction. The direction to become better than we currently are. It doesn't judge or give details. It just simply lights the way. But here's the thing, you start from where you start. We all start from where we start. That's the way it is. And that start is with a decision to seek out happiness. To go beyond means to learn from our unhappiness, to learn from our negative emotions, which tell you what didn't work and what you maybe need to reconsider about yourself, actually, not about the world. The world is the way it is. Your reactions are yours. They're your free lessons. Some of that happens by accident. You've grown as you've got older. You've learned things. Of course you have. And as you go through life, then most of us kind of seem to get off the bus at a certain point. We seem to stop growing at a certain point. We kind of seem to settle out at a certain way of being. And we seem to grow a little beyond that. The next level beyond the decision to seek out happiness takes specific self-work. Resolving our negative emotions. Very few people get to that. This is what you'll read about in the self-development books. This is what the Dalai Lama talks about in his book on happiness. Learn from your emotions. Learn what they're teaching you. I believe your negative emotions are trying to teach you something, like a feedback system. Feedback systems are common in nature to guide you, to improve your thinking, to help you, to protect you, asking you to learn new thinking and responses and grow emotionally, to deal with the world as it is instead of the way you'd like it to be or the way you think it should be. So you learn some kind of resilience, not uncaring, but recognizing what is, instead of standing as, in fact, King Canute tried to demonstrate to his courtiers that if you hold against the world and tell it how it should be, it's like, and he asked the courtiers to take him on his throne, place him at the water's edge, at the waves, at the incoming tide, and he held up his hand to stop the waves, to make the point. You cannot change the world as it is. You have to deal with the world as you find it. That's not to not care. It's to work with, like mental aikido, the martial arts of thinking, rather than confronting and being flattened, which only, in fact, increases resistance and creates enemies or negative reaction. You learn that things aren't necessarily all about you, that stuff happens, and it is what it is, and you learn to attract less of what you don't need. Think about the bully at school and the person who gets bullied. You take the person who gets bullied, you put them in another class. What happens? That's right, someone else starts, the process repeats. You can take as many bullies out as you like. The thing that you can do, the only long-term work you can do, is on the person who gets bullied. Not that you should, it's just that that's the only place you'll fix it. It's just the way it is. So this usually means some kind of therapy of some kind. It does, unfortunately does, if you want to call it that, working on yourself, self-development. You could take a lifetime of daily dedicated meditation. You could. 2 hours a day for 20 years, if you've got the time. Most of us haven't got the time. But either way, the process is to get rid of the skewed and limiting ideas and childish responses that we learned, that we took on when we didn't know any better. We were children once, dealing with things the way we thought we should when we were growing up. But then we generalized them and we forgot. And it goes on. There's always more. There's always more. You can always learn more about yourself. You can always do better. How much? It's not for me to say. It depends on imponderable questions that get into the philosophical or the esoteric or the spiritual, if you like. But here's the thing. You start with a decision. A simple decision. In fact, to have more fun doing what you do. There's the starting point, isn't it? To decide that happiness will be important to you. Then begin doing more of what you like after that and less of what you don't. That's the next stage. Now that's when it starts to bring up things. Once you start doing more of what you like and less of what you don't, if you keep going in that direction, stuff will start to come up. begin to show up in the form of resistances you have, doubts you have, other unhelpful beliefs you have about yourself and others, other unpleasant reactions to things, yeah, that's when you start a slightly more serious path. But that's the way. And it starts with a decision to pursue happiness, which may seem selfish, but ultimately, I believe, is pointing in the direction of your self-growth, which means ultimately more acceptance of what is, which means you can make a greater contribution to the planet, which is the depth aspect of happiness, which means it's not only a shallow pursuit